Alrighty, hello everybody. Welcome into yet another week here of Three Up, Three Down. Another part here of our series. Current series, as we've kind of talked about last week, is on the habits of successful plate umpires. And last week we focused a lot on our pre-pitch mechanics in the whole conversation of strike zone strategy. Today we'll take a look at part two of that conversation, which kind of goes away from like pre-pitch routine, although we'll definitely touch base with it a little bit and focus more specifically then on proper use of eyes, particularly then here with regards to tracking and things of that nature. So that is kind of what's on the forefront of the agenda for us today. A couple announcements and things like that before we get started here. First of all, a lot of you guys have taken time to fill out the post-game feedback form. Eventually, we'll get that back in the chat at some point today. Really appreciated and really enjoyed reading through a lot of people's feedback in terms of what you're giving to partners and what partners are giving to you, what you're working on, how it's going, all that kind of stuff. So thanks for taking the time to fill those out. Please continue to do so because that information is very valuable. It seems like a lot of people are focusing on proper use of eyes and chest to ball, which is a great couple of things to go ahead and work on. Again, trying to build those habits as we've talked about for quite some time here, that we're a little bit behind as we get into 2021 and obviously trying to build towards our futures and what we want to go ahead and accomplish. So please keep doing that one here. I read an interesting bit yesterday on how long it takes to build habits, and the average length is anywhere from 2 to 6 months. And as I mentioned last week, that 2 to 6 months range in building habits, obviously that's what we're trying to do here this season. So give yourself some grace, work with yourself, be patient with yourself, but just continue to dial in on those habits, take your time, and don't try and choose too many as we get back onto the diamond there as well. Remember, we issued the focal points for 2021. Those have been out there as well. Continue to revisit those and think about those as you hit the diamond. And then the last announcement I've got here, again, for most of the people in the central region that are with us, Alumni Weekend's that first weekend of our regional tournament. And even though you will not be allowed to be in the new facility to watch the tournament this year when there's no spectators, I do know that our Alumni Association is still putting on the breakfast and things like that. So if you're interested in coming down, you'll get have the breakfast and whatnot. That stuff is available, and that information is available for you on the Central Region Umpires Facebook page. Brian Wild and John Ignacio are kind of the two that are going to lead that charge. But again, if you come down to that, just realize that you will not be permitted to attend anything at the regional site for the regional tournament. So there's a B-dubs there, so you guys can go ahead and take a look at stuff there. But unfortunately, no spectator attendance here at the regional here so far. So those are my three announcements here to get started. Anybody have anything else? Tom, I'll give you the floor to you if you've got anything for anyone. Cool. All righty. Well, let's go ahead and dig into it then. I'll go ahead and share my screen and get moving here with what we've got on tap for us today. Again, I've got, I didn't hit the right button. Give me 1 second here to, I know that I started to share, but I have some sound and whatnot that I want to optimize here for us this time. So I know that I have kind of given you a brief description as to what exactly we're looking at here for us for the most part today. And that obviously is on strike zone strategy, part number 2. And today's focus then is on proper use of eyes. Now we'll revisit some of the things we talked about last week with some stance basics just very briefly here in just a second. But ultimately here, what we're looking for in terms of a strike zone strategy is kind of a two-part approach. Number one, that pre-pitch stuff that we do has to be consistent. And then our use of eyes has to be intentional. So that is kind of the major focus, the major thought process here for us today. Now, a couple points of review. So this is my review slide a little bit from what we talked about last week and to try and transition us then into the idea of proper use of eyes. And we've been on this now part 2 journey of strike zone strategy. And if you remember, it all roots in the definition of a strategy, and the theory therein basically says that a strategy is an action plan to accomplish a goal. And one thing I shared with you last week was that our goal oftentimes as plate umpires, if a coach asked you, hey, what's your goal in a strike zone? You would probably say to be consistent. And yes, consistency is important, but let's be real. You can be bad and be consistent. So I think our goal here, maybe not necessarily just consistency, but rather a fair and accurate strike zone. And if we're concentrated then on doing what we need to do to call a fair and accurate zone, consistency then is essentially an outcome. So I think our goal and our focal points of what we do pre-pitch and those habits and fundamentals and what we're building there with our stance and then how we perceive the strike zone through our proper use of eyes, as we'll talk about today, is to get to this goal, a fair and accurate strike zone, which ultimately produces consistency. So our goal is not necessarily consistency, but rather a fair and accurate zone. Now, in order to get there, we have to have an action plan. And again, there's 2 parts to this action plan. What we do pre-pitch has to be consistent, because that sets us up to be able to perceive the zone. So that's, heel toe, that's the slot positioning, that's head height, things of that nature here, all that we talked about last week. And then secondly, as we'll talk about this week, the second part of that action plan or that strategy to call a fair and accurate zone is to use our eyes properly. Now, last week, remember, we talked about our pre-pitch routine and we broke it down into 4 different segments. Number 1, what exactly do you do pre-pitch? Take some time in between pitches, relax. But how we step into our stance must be consistent and allow us to be comfortable. Because if that stance then and our approach is not consistent, is not comfortable, then we're not going to be in a good spot to perceive the zone or to use our eyes properly. So that's why that's step number 1 of our action plan, that our pre-pitch routine has to be consistent, has to allow us to be comfortable to ultimately perceive the zone correctly. We also talked about footwork. Now, before I get into the heel-toe relationships, remember we talked about stepping in with our slot foot first. Slot foot being the one that is closest to the hitter. So that way we are positioned, if you remember why, that puts us more likely to be in a position that's more aggressive in the slot or the midpoint, that area, that fluid midpoint between the hitter and the catcher. That's where we want our head to be to perceive the zone. So we want to step in with our slot foot first, the one that's closest to the hitter, and then set our trail foot or our drop foot. We talked about the heel-toe relationship and the heel-toe stance mainly last week. Remember, the heel-toe stance isn't the only one we can use. People use the Jerry Davis lock box where our feet are a little bit more parallel. There are still some people that use the scissors out there. And regardless of our stance, provided we are comfortable, positioned in the slot, then that's going to allow us to go ahead and perceive the zone correctly. And that's the point here of pre-pitch routine. We want to be in a spot where we consistently enter or approach that area to be able to perceive the strike zone effectively. Now, we talked about heel-toe relationships in 3 of them. One with ourself. Okay, so that was our heel-toe relationship with self. The one with catcher, so that we afforded the catcher freedom of movement. And then obviously we also talked about our slot foot again being at the heel of the batter so that we are more aggressive in the slot. And as I mentioned, our footwork, we want to step in with our slot foot first and then our drop foot or our trail foot to go ahead and get ourselves set for the strike zone. We also moved up to the upper body. We talked about the importance of being square. We'll mention that here again in a clip that I've got here from us from one of our clinics in 2018. Remember, we want to be square to the release point of the pitcher, slight torso lean forward here to help us lock in, and then we want to make sure that we're set at the proper time. So again, all of those 4 things, pre-pitch set position, footwork, your upper body, and setting at the proper time, all what we talked about last week as part 1 of our strategy, and that then is our pre-pitch routine. And if we can do those things consistently, that sets us up to be able to use our eyes properly, to perceive the zone, and then as I mentioned, get to our goal of calling a fair and accurate strike zone. Now, the proper use of eyes here is where I want to go ahead and adjust to. And before we kind of start to talk about proper use of eyes, just very briefly want to give the definition of a strike zone, because I think that's part of it too. Like, we've got to know what the definition of the strike zone is in order to be able to perceive it. Rulebook defines it as the space over home plate between the batter's armpits and the tops of the knees when the batter assumes a natural stance to swing at the pitch. There is a theory out there that the strike zone is 3D, that it has width, depth, and height from this entire definition here. So there are people out there that believe that the ball has to go through the entire part of the plate as a 3-dimensional object here as we start to talk about the strike zone too. So just a couple different theories out there to think about as we begin to think about perceiving the strike zone. Now, obviously, that's the textbook definition. That's the rulebook definition. And as we sit here and as Little League umpires, I think what we are definitely advocates of is being aggressive with our strike zone. Mark Bernstein probably says it best to his umpires when he talks about the plate and calling pitches, is that the pitch is a strike until it's proven otherwise. The pitch is a strike until it's proven otherwise. So we want to be aggressive in calling the entire zone. But as you see here, we've got to set a boundary that's not absurd relative to the level that we're calling. So be aggressive with strikes. We have our definition of our strike zone. And as we're talking about proper use of eyes, remember, our stance sets us up to perceive the zone. Our eyes then obviously track it in as we're going to talk about it. But big picture wise, consistent pre-pitch routine, aggressive in calling pitches, but not absurd to the boundaries. And we'll talk about what exactly that looks like and how dependent it is upon our proper use of eyes here. Now, we use a variety of different drills, and Mark, I know you guys do this. Mike, you guys do it a lot in the Southeast. Tom, you guys do it a ton at umpire school as well. But, there's a ton of different drills. The soft toss drill, we use a drill called a 2-minute drill where there's very little time in between pitches, basically to get, tracking and stepping in as a habit. But we also use this colored plate drill, which is kind of like the end goal. I guess this is kind of like the last thing that we build to. And I mentioned it here, and I want to talk about kind of the importance of our stance and its relation to our eyes here before we even get into more about proper use of eyes. So this drill is one that we use at umpire school. We stole it from United Umpires. So we have a plate here that's basically on a piece of wood. So we have that here, and we have a green area that's basically right over the home plate. We've got the black area that is seen as the river, if you will, the white that marks the line, and then the red that marks the dirt. And what we'll ask our umpires to do is they'll just call pitches naturally, balls and strikes, relative to the height and then obviously their zone. But we'll ask them to call pitches and then ultimately call the color. So, for example, if they call a strike and they get that half the ball was on the black and half the ball was on like the green, they would call basically strike green or strike black. And if they ball it, they may go ball white. So what this allows us to do then is understand how they are perceiving the zone. It's not necessarily messing with or calibrating the strike zone. That's not necessarily the goal here. Rather, it's for us to be able to see where exactly are they actually calling the pitches. Because again, this is all about proper use of eyes. Our stance allows us to perceive the strike zone, perceive where these pitches are at, and if they are calling an incorrect color, and we'll videotape this, if they're calling an incorrect color, that gives us an adjustment to their stance and then tells us that their stance is not allowing them to perceive pitches or use their eyes correctly. So it's a great tracking drill. It's a great timing drill too, just kind of putting it all together. But that's kind of the basics of the drill. Now, what I want to show here is DJ's reps at this one in 2018. And I want to kind of talk about his shoulders here because that was one of the major concepts that we talked about when we started talking about things last week. If you take a look here, DJ's probably a little bit too slightly pronounced in his turn with his shoulders, okay? And I'll try and play this volume up here for us because I think it's important for us to kind of hear what happens. And I've got the pitch slowed down so we can kind of see where exactly or approximate where this pitch is coming in at. So here's DJ. First pitch is going to come in. Okay, probably a little bit further on the white here. He calls it a strike. Seth is the instructor. He asks, hey, what color?
Green?
He says green. Okay, DJ says green. All right, so right out of the gate, our instructors know, wait a minute, that pitch was like on the white, maybe the black. It wasn't necessarily on the green. We have a situation to go ahead and deal with. So here's the second pitch coming in.
Ball black.
He calls it ball black, which is basically the area in between the corner and the batter's box. And this is probably more on the white/red of the batter's box when it came in. So we can see that DJ is not perceiving the strike zone correctly. So it's probably a stance issue. It could potentially be proper use of eyes as well.
Stop.
Seth stops the drill.
Hang on. Those two pitches?
And then he tells him where those two pitches were. So Seth says...
The first one was on the inside corner of the white.
First one was on the inside corner of the white.
The second one was over the white.
The second one was over the white. And Seth is like literally standing right behind him with the camera. So here's the next pitch that DJ has. Probably on the white.
Green.
DJ calls it in the green.
Black.
Now, Jose Matamoros, who's a minor league umpire that we had at this clinic, says, hold on, that was like dead center of the black.
Dead center.
Of the black?
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a situation we've got to go ahead and deal with. Now, what we basically do is allow DJ to call a couple more pitches, and finally Jose has this brilliant idea that maybe his shoulders aren't square. So he squares them up. Forgets to call what color pitch that one is.
What are you thinking?
And here's the analysis.
Too crooked and I need to square up more.
Yeah. DJ asks, am I too crooked and I need to square up more? And Jose says, yeah, that's exactly it.
I think you were like looking at it, not this egregious, but I think you're looking at it like this instead of like this. Okay.
So instead of watching it like with the pronounced square to the outside corner, we got to square up. And essentially that then, and this is the whole point from last week to this week, is that in order for us to perceive the strike zone correctly and actually get something out of our eyes, we have to be aligned correctly. And that's our footwork. That's, head height, yes. And then obviously being square here too.
Not that far, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And DJ gets it.
Inches could be that much way out there.
So now DJ's got to make an adjustment. And here's the next pitch after he gets adjusted to it.
Ball black.
It says ball black.
Nailed it.
And Seth confirms from looking up top of the ladder. That was right on the black.
Nailed it.
You're right.
Your second pitch, you called that one a strike on the green.
Okay.
Second pitch of his plate work, he called it a strike on the green.
Ball. White.
Now he's getting them right. He said ball white.
Green.
Strike green.
Green. Where on the plate?
Jose asks where on the plate, and DJ's able to go straight to it and say, hey, this is where I saw it. Okay? So again, it's important to tie together the two things that we've kind of talked about here last week: the ability to step in and be square, those fundamental basics, and then ultimately make sure then here that not only our shoulders are square, but now we can talk about our use of eyes to give us a chance then to get these pitches right and make sure that we're calling a fair and accurate zone, yes, but at least one that we know where those pitches are. And that's the big thing. We need to make sure that we know where those pitches are. Your judgment, your strike zone is your strike zone, okay? But as long as we can see and know where those pitches are, that's proper use of eyes, which is dependent on things that we talked about last week, our stance basics. DJ, Seth, anything in the chat here or anything like that to go ahead and talk a little bit more about here before we go ahead and move on?
Go ahead, Deej.
I mean, not in particular. I think it goes to show, one point that I made while I was learning was, that 2-inch movement of squaring the shoulders might not have felt like a lot, where I was, but the depth perception on the outside, 2 inches here is a mile, that way. So it's just incredibly important to make sure that we're remembering those things. And I think literally one pitch difference just by squaring the shoulders just showed an incredible difference there. And Rosie agrees. So
here's the other thing about I'm sorry. Go ahead, Seth.
No, I was just going to jump in and say that, to echo exactly what DJ said, that drill, and especially that particular instance of film, just shows how important having that pre-pitch routine and getting yourself square to that release point is to calling this fair and accurate zone that we're all trying to get to. Like DJ said, that 2 pitches up top equated to almost 6 inches out there on the plate. So as long we just need to strive to get to that square release point, and that will open up the door, and you'll see pitches completely different. And I think DJ can.
Yeah. Good points. And we're kind of transitioning here now to talk a little bit more exclusively at proper use of eyes, and that's kind of been the lurking context here in it as well. And I think we get that we're supposed to track it, and obviously we have to see things in order to be able to call them correctly and have that fair and accurate strike zone like we've mentioned. But what's important here is that our eyes and the way that we use our eyes is our system of credibility. So that's why our eyes and tracking are so friggin' important. We got to get our eyes to where they need to be because, again, they help us to, as we see here, avoid basically an erosion of credibility. Now, remember, we want to be aggressive in calling balls and strikes. We want to make sure that the pitch is a strike. We want to make sure that we're calling strikes. We think here, to Mark's point here, that the pitch is a strike until it's proven otherwise. So aggressive in calling strikes, but not absurd to the boundary relative to the level that we're calling. So make sure that we keep that in mind. Now, at the same time, catcher's presentation, depending on level, does have an impact on this. So there is that conversation. But nonetheless, the way that we use our eyes helps us build our credibility as ball strike umpires. So for example, if we take a look at this clip, okay, we have a catcher who obviously sets up on the outer edge and then receives the pitch as such, okay? Again, our credibility is dependent upon our usage of eyes. So, we may see this pitch as a strike, like that it may have caught the corner here, whatever the case may be. But again, remember, our usage of eyes allows us to process information and then make the right determination. Now, I'm not one to sit here and argue whether or not this pitch is a ball or a strike. But what I can tell you is that the perception of the greater people out there is that this pitch probably wasn't a strike. And unfortunately, our umpire calls it a strike. Okay? So again, if you take a look, our goal here is to use our eyes so that we get a little bit more credibility. And the thought process here, take a look at the reaction of the batter. I think this pitch, the pitcher probably knows that he got a gift. The catcher probably knows that he probably got a gift. The batter's like, wait a minute, there's no way I don't think I can hit that pitch. So like when we're talking about usage of eyes and erosion of credibility, is we don't want to start giving pitches that people know are not strikes. Because the last thing we want this catcher to do is to go back in the middle of the first and say, hey guys, you better be ready to swing the bat because this umpire's calling something that's 7 or 8 inches outside. Okay, so we want to make sure, again, that we're aggressive calling balls and strikes. I want to make that point clear. We want to get pitches to be called strikes. No one's in there to watch Johnny walk to first base 1,000,000 times in the game. We want to get strikes and be aggressive, but it's got to be relative to the level we're calling and not absurd to the boundary. And again, we want to get pitches that the catcher knows are legitimate, strikes. And the borderline pitches like this one kind of got to make them look a little bit better than this catcher did. Okay? So that's just one thing to think about here with regards to our eyes regarding this whole idea of the erosion of credibility. Now, Brian DeBrouwer is the one that gave me this phrase, erosion of credibility. I forgot to give credit at the start of things here. And again, our usage of eyes allows us to avoid the erosion of credibility. And remember, our usage of eyes is dependent upon our pre-pitch routine. So again, we don't want to call pitches that the catcher knows should not be called strikes, as we kind of saw an example potentially of in the previous clip. But again, in order to avoid that, we just have to slow ourselves down, step in like we talked about last week consistently, and then use our eyes properly. Allow our eyes to do the work. Now, we're going to track the baseball. Many of us have learned about tracking. Again, we want to see our eyes follow the ball from the hand to the glove, and I'll make that point here in just a second. Our eyes are tracking while the head is still. Many of us on the outside corner will still turn our head here with the outside corner pitch. Remember, head still, eyes are tracking the ball to the glove. Now, remember, our eyes are going to follow the ball into the glove, not just into the strike zone. Many of you have probably been told that your timing's a little quick on the plate, probably only track the ball to the strike zone, and then you're already making your decision. Or some people that you've given feedback to who are quick on the plate are probably doing the same thing. So if we see someone that is quick while calling the plate, we need to tell them to track the ball all the way to the glove and then make a decision. So proper use of eyes here allows us to, number one, avoid the erosion of credibility. But secondly, then it also produces our proper timing. So eyes then here allow us to have proper timing. So what's the benefit of proper use of eyes? Well, number one, it helps us watch pitches come in and avoid this erosion of credibility. But it also, as I mentioned here, gives us proper timing. If someone has ever told you that your timing is too quick, what they should be telling you is that you are not using your eyes properly. Proper timing is a result of or a product of our proper use of eyes. Think about it as if you were coming to a four-way stop, and let's say you and somebody else or a couple other people come to that stop at the same time. If you don't use your eyes to watch those other drivers and you just go, it's going to be ugly in that four-way stop. But again, if you stop there when all those people arrive about at the same time and you guys look up at one another, now all of a sudden each one of your timing is great so that you don't run into each other, or hopefully you don't. So again, just as we would approach a four-way stop that way, the same is true with the way we use our eyes, whether it be on pitches, tag plays, force plays, catch, no catch, fair foul, hits batsman, whatever it might be. Our usage of eyes is what gives us proper timing. And anyone who has ever told you to count a second, take a breath, read the label on the back of the gloves, all they're giving you is a false delay tactic. We need to slow the process down and allow our eyes to be our system of credibility, and ultimately that is where we get our timing. A couple other things here about the benefits of our usage of our eyes. If we allow our eyes to do the work, we lose the excited knee-jerk reactions. No longer are we coming up super quick and trying to sell a strike call because we're really trying to go ahead and make that super exciting. So we're not looking for super exciting signals, but rather than just informed decisions about how well we process the information before us. So we have signals then, as a result of our proper use of eyes, that are not excited reactions, but rather than a response to what we see right in front of us. So instead of on a borderline pitch where we see it, and that's the one that we pause, and then we come up and call a strike, that uneven timing then is basically a product of inappropriately using our eyes. We want nice, even timing. And again, that's following the ball from the hand all the way to the glove. And again, important to note here, not only do we get timing, not only do we get our even pace behind the plate to gain credibility, again, the whole product as a result of good pre-pitch stance and then ultimately proper use of eyes is ultimately gaining credibility. We gain credibility through our proper use of eyes. Now, how do we develop the proper use of eyes? Well, number one, I mentioned this here, eliminate false delay tactics. Again, if someone told you to take a breath, count to three, read the back of the glove before you call a strike, that is a false delay tactic. We want the process to slow down. Allow your eyes to follow the ball from the hand to the glove. And we want to make sure that that process, just as our pre-pitch routine was, is the same every single time. That's what gives us the ability to call an accurate and fair strike zone. Institute the habit of processing pitches the same way every time. And again, where we'll know our timing is the best is when we have nice, even timing. Evidence of proper use of eyes on pitches then is found on even timing. Whether it's an obvious strike or, as you see here, a borderline strike, our timing should be the same. Timing should be the same. And if it's not, that means that we're not using our eyes properly throughout the game. Uneven timing erodes credibility. Think about it. If you've got timing, that's been clear and consistent pitch after pitch, and then all of a sudden you get a couple borderline pitches that you pause on, that's going to erode your credibility. How do we avoid the erosion of credibility? proper use of eyes. We allow it to get to the glove every single time. We use that process of processing the pitchings every single time so that we have that even timing. A couple video clips here to go ahead and round us out. Really good look at this umpire's tracking as this one comes all the way in. Nice little slow shot. You can see him track it all the way here. In this case, it's all the way to the bat. But again, we want to allow the ball to travel to the glove before we're even trying to make a decision. And before we're even trying to make a decision. Now, evidence of proper timing is going to be evident. Remember, evidence of proper timing is evident in even timing. So if we take a look at this umpire, maybe a little bit low in his head height and things like that, but his pace and his demeanor, as you notice here, is nice and smooth. He's got nice, even timing. His reactions are not, his strike calls are not excited reactions. They're more just responses to the decisions that his eyes have made for him. And as a result then here, our proper use of eyes will show up, in this case, in proper timing, this nice evident timing, where we're not necessarily super quick on the obvious ones. We don't have timing, one timing on obvious ones and another element of timing on borderline pitches. Everything is nice and even, okay? Not excited reactions. So again, proper use of eyes helps us to avoid the erosion of credibility. It provides us with credibility and then also produces that nice even timing that we're after. Now, the last thing that I've got here for us, if I can get to the slide, are a couple different takeaways here as we go ahead and get ready to round up the rest of today's episode. And as we talked about strike zone strategy, remember strategy, just this action plan to go ahead and accomplish a goal. The goal is a fair and accurate strike zone, which goes ahead and gives us consistency. As we mentioned last week, that goal then to call a fair and accurate zone depended upon two things. Number one, our ability to perceive the zone, which is set up by our pre-pitch habits, the stance basics, those fundamentals that we want to see come about. But secondly, proper use of eyes is the biggest in-pitch mechanic for us to make sure that we focus on. And what I'll say, and I think, Gary, you said this last week, especially in our post game as we were talking, was that you've got to think about the things that go ahead and root you when you are struggling. So we've all had games out there when we are struggling to be consistent, or we just haven't felt great behind the plate. Maybe it's we've got a left-handed catcher. Maybe we've got a pitcher with a funky arm angle, or one's throwing 65 and the other one's throwing 25, which obviously happens, right? The answer then is to do these two things. Focus first on your ability to set yourself up, and then secondly, use your eyes. Let the ball travel, track the baseball, focus on those two things. And it's great because they're pre-pitch and then in-pitch. And then ultimately that allows us to reset. So again, our goal to call a fair and accurate strike zone is dependent upon these two things. Number one, the fact that our perception of the strike zone is affected by pre-pitch habits. And we spent a lot of time with that last week and our stance fundamentals. And then this week, our major point, our proper use of eyes gives us timing, yes, but allows us then to go ahead and process things the same way every single time to, number one, give us great timing, and then secondly, to allow us then to build credibility. And as we mentioned last week, when you're struggling, you got to think about two or three things then that you can use to go ahead and refocus on. And for us, a lot of times here, that is on pre-pitch routine so that you're set up in the slot with good stance basics, and then great tracking. And then I would probably argue, and some people can argue this as well, I've heard Jerry Davis say it too, that probably your usage of eyes is the most important factor here in calling pitches and in getting yourself reset when you're struggling. So, as you're struggling, we've all had these games and things like that. Allow yourself to step back, take a breath, reset, and then pick two or three things that you've got to work on. And for me, at least, it's always number one, let me make sure I get set up to perceive the zone. And then secondly, let me make sure that I'm tracking it as I should so that I then, number one, avoid the erosion of credibility. And then secondly, that my timing is where it needs to be. Go ahead and pause there and open it up here for questions and whatnot here, or anything like that, or anything else to add from anyone here. Mike, Tom, Mark, and anything out there to add on top of some of the things we've discussed here? All right. Well, if not, we'll hang around like we normally do. I appreciate everyone being here. Just a couple closing thoughts here and reminders here for us. Next week, we'll be back on for some more talk on the fundamentals of plate mechanics, of what makes a successful plate umpire. Specifically next week, though, we'll move away from calling pitches and look more at efficient movement from behind the plate. So we'll talk about when we are supposed to hang on to point of plate and when we're actually supposed to be out in the dirt circle and out and active on and up the line and things like that. So we hope you can join us then for next week. Again, 12:30 Eastern here on 3 Up, 3 Down. We'll talk about efficient movement as the plate umpire as part 3 then here of our series on the habits that make successful plate umpires. Continue to go ahead and fill out those post-game feedback forms if you would. There's been great information. Continue to work on using your eyes properly, staying chest to ball, especially out in the field. And as I mentioned here, we've given you a lot of things to work on here and think about in plate mechanics last week, proper use of eyes this week, and then we'll even talk more about those things as we talk about movement efficiently from behind the plate next week. Just do one thing here at a time. Remember, it takes 2 to 6 months to build a habit. So give yourself some grace. Don't do it well one time and then move on to something else. Continue to build those habits game after game, pitch after pitch, compete on each pitch here, and then make sure then that you're giving yourself some grace. Again, 2 to 6 months to build those habits. Keep looking at those focal points and using 2021 here to get better at those little things so that we can go ahead and accomplish the goals that we're set after. Guys, we'll be back again 12:30 p.m. next Friday here for part 3 of the series on efficient movement of a plate umpire here, taking a look then at those habits that make successful plate umpires. Appreciate everybody's time and attention. Thanks for being here. We'll hang out and talk here after. But other than that, guys, I'll see you next week. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you then.